Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on Jacksonian Democracy, 1829 to 1841. Now, to start off, what is Jacksonian democracy? Well, Jacksonian democracy is an evolution of Jeffersonian democracy, which had preceded it during the 1800s through the mid to late 1820s. During this period, you see the strength of the American presidency expanded. The presidential power is strengthened at the expense of Congress. Congressional power is weakened greatly during this period of time. This is during the period of time that the presidency, not the head of the legislative branches, become the real firm power here in the United States. They also seek to broaden the public participation in government. Under the Federalist, only white males with property could vote. Under the Jeffersonians, white men with property or education could vote. Now, under Jacksonian democracy, all white men could vote. Now, the common themes that will surround this idea of Jacksonianism during this period will be expanded suffrage. That is, of course, obviously the allowing all white men to vote. Political patronage, offering people jobs who support you during an election campaign. Expanding into the Western territories. These people also believed in a strict interpretation of the United States Constitution, or strict constructionism. And finally, they believed in laissez-faire economic policy, meaning very little government regulation in the economy of the United States. Now, the president that is most identified with Jacksonian democracy is, of course, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson will be president from 1829 to 1837. He was born in March of 1767 in the Waxhaw settlement, basically on the North Carolina-South Carolina border. He was the son of Andrew Jackson and Elizabeth Hutchinson, two Scot-Irish immigrants who had left Carrickfergus, Ireland in 1765. They moved here to the United States and settled on the borderlands between North and South Carolina. When Andrew Jackson Sr. died in February of 1767, he was only 29 years old, and it was 3 weeks before his son was born. Now, during the American Revolution, he will enlist in the Carolina militia. He will be a courier. His oldest brother is killed in a battle in June of 1779. And Andrew and his younger brother Robert will both be captured and become prisoners of war throughout the later part of the American Revolution. They will suffer from starvation and smallpox. He will suffer from this throughout his life. A British officer will also slash him with a sword, leaving scars on his left head and hand. Unfortunately, his younger brother does die in April of 1781, only a few days after they were released. They were released because their mother volunteered to nurse British prisoners in Charleston. And while she's there, she ends up dying of cholera in November of 1781. So Andrew Jackson will be an orphan here by 1781. Jackson will marry for the first time in 1790. He marries a woman by the name of Rachel Donaldson Robards. She had previously been married once before, but what they didn't know is after they got married, they found out that the first husband did not sign the divorce papers. So they ended up having to get remarried in 1794. Fun fact, Andrew Jackson actually had to hunt the guy down and force him to sign the divorce papers. Remember, this is a time when women had no actual political rights. So Yes, a man had to agree to a divorce for a divorce to be final. They adopted 3 children together. They will not have any children of their own. They will also stand guardian for another 8 children, including some Native American children. Jackson will serve throughout his life, not only in the military, but he'll be the first member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Tennessee from 1796 to 97. He'll be a U.S. Senator from Tennessee from 1823 to 1825. He will be the military governor of Florida in 1821. And he'll also be a member of the Tennessee Supreme Court from 1798 and until 1798 to 1804, I believe. Jackson was also nicknamed Old Hickory. He was seen to be as tough and aggressive as a hickory tree, so many people referred to him as Old Hickory. Now, just a couple of firsts about President Jackson. Jackson is the first president to be born in a log cabin. Jackson is also the first to ride in a railroad car while in office. Jackson is basically the last true British subject to be elected president of the United States. Most everyone else elected afterwards will have been born in the United States, or at least during the American Revolution. Now let's first start looking at the domestic policy of President Jackson. And we'll start by looking at the federal debt. Then we'll go look at his policy towards the Electoral College. We'll look at the spoils system. We'll look at the Bank of the United States of America. We'll look at the nullification crisis. And finally, we will look at Indian removal. These will be the chief domestic policy of the Jackson administration from 1829 to 1837. Now, when it comes to the federal debt, the United States of America will pay off the national debt for the first and only time in American history. Jackson will do this by deep cuts to government spending, doing away with certain government jobs, and of course, just simply, in some cases, refusing to pay bills. So, for the first time in American history, the United States will no longer be in debt. The national debt is gone. And this is an important thing, but this will also lead to a major economic depression in the late 1830s. So while this is a positive for the Jackson administration, it will not be a positive for the following Van Buren administration. Now, President Jackson hated the Electoral College. We still have this debate today. It's amazing that we still have an Electoral College because this debate has been going on since the founding of our country. But Andrew Jackson called for the abolition of the Electoral College. He argued that it was undemocratic, it gave small states too much power over large states, and that the fact that the popular vote nationwide did not matter really irritated Jackson because in 1824 he won the popular vote but did not become president because he did not win the electoral vote. And so he tries to get Congress to do something on the Electoral College, but there is no congressional action during this time. And of course, obviously, we continue to have to deal with problems with the Electoral College here, even into the modern day. But that was his philosophy on the Electoral College, and he had personal reason to dislike it. The spoils system. Well, Andrew Jackson believed that a certain percentage of the federal government should be allowed to be appointed by the President of the United States. And he felt this was important because we needed rotation in office to not only bring in new ideas, but to prevent a corrupt bureaucracy. The problem is he wanted to actually reopen these government jobs for party supporters, people who supported him and his policies during the election. And while the American government up through the 1820s had people who had been hired by all different administrations, going back to George Washington in 1789, Jackson will do his best to weed out most of the non-Jackson hires. And so by the time it's all said and done, by the time he leaves office in the 1830s, about 20 to 25% of government employees who had worked in the federal government prior to his election will be fired, and they will be replaced by party loyalists. Now, I want to be clear that Jackson does not create the spoils system. It had been in use prior to him becoming president, but he did encourage its growth. And during his presidency and afterwards, the spoils system becomes a major problem. If he was trying to prevent corrupt bureaucracy, he did the complete opposite by enacting his reforms. Next was the Bank of the United States of America. Now, the Bank of the United States of America had been reauthorized in 1816. It was done by President James Madison, and he was forced to do it because of the War of 1812. He had let the charter lapse, and during the war, we needed money. And so in 1836, he reauthorizes the Bank of the United States of America. Well, the bank was up for a charter renewal in 1836, but President Jackson convinces him to ask for early renewal, and therefore the renewal date for the Jackson administration will be moved up to 1832. Well, what happens is Congress will pass the bill reauthorizing the Bank of the United States under the supervision of Henry Clay, and they send the bill to President Jackson for his approval, and he will veto the legislation. And not only does he veto it, he tells us for the first time in American history why a president is vetoing it. And he said, first, it concentrated the nation's financial strength into a single institution, and by doing this, it exposed the government to control by foreign interests. He argued that it was really the purpose of the bank to make the rich richer at the expense of the poor. He also argued that the bank exercised too much control over individual members of Congress. He also favored he said it favored the Northeast banking states over the Southern and Western agricultural states who didn't necessarily need a national bank. Finally, he called for its veto because he felt that the banks were controlled by a few select families. This was a total break in tradition. Prior to this, a president vetoed something because it was because he felt that it was unconstitutional. Now, for the first time, a president is outlining his legislative preferences instead of whether a bill is constitutional or unconstitutional. And this is the beginning of why we veto legislation today. This is how presidents veto legislation today. Next, we look at the nullification crisis. Well, the Southerners were still upset by the Tariff of 1828, or the Tariff of Abominations. And they were upset because this tariff on manufactured goods was hurting them more than it was hurting the northern industrialists. And part of the problem was the South was agricultural. It either got its manufactured goods from the North, or it preferred to get them from Europe. So if they got these goods from Europe, then unfortunately, they would have to pay a tariff on it. Well, the Southerners were very upset. They wanted this to go away. And this was led by Vice President John C. Calhoun. Calhoun had been vice president since 1825. He had been John Quincy Adams' vice president, and now he is Andrew Jackson's vice president. And at the South Carolina Exposition and Protest of 1828, Vice President Calhoun will announce that states have the power to nullify federal laws that were not in their interests. Now, Jackson was sympathetic to the South, but he was a strong supporter of the federal union. And so this comes to a head at the Jefferson Day dinner in April of 1830. A gentleman by the name of Robert Haynes, who was the U.S. Senator from South Carolina at the time, got up and gave a toast. And he said, quote, "The union of the states and the sovereignty of the states." And Jackson, being president, interrupted to give his toast. And he says, quote, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Well, usually the president has the last word. But John C. Calhoun gets up and he gives a toast and he says, "To the Union, next to our liberty, most dear." Well, obviously, this does not make the old man happy. Andrew Jackson will become very bitter towards his vice president. Calhoun realizes that the writing is on the wall, that he is probably not going to be renominated in 1832 to be reelected on the Jackson ticket in 1832. Vice President Calhoun will resign on December 28, 1832. The following day, the state of South Carolina will appoint him as a U.S. Senator on December 29, 1832. Senator Calhoun will now spend the rest of the Jackson administration fighting against Jacksonian policies. Now, President Jackson will threaten to send federal troops to South Carolina to enforce federal law. He denied the Southerners' argument that they had the right to secession. He argued that it was unconstitutional, and he said, quote, "The Constitution forms a government, not a league. To say that any state may at pleasure secede from the Union is to say that the United States is not a nation." And so this is becoming very heated. Jackson arguing that he will lead federal troops to South Carolina. The Southerners are arguing to leave the Union. So Congress will propose a compromise, and this will be called the Compromise Tariff of 1833. There will still be import taxation, but beginning in 1842, it will be reduced gradually. And by mid to late 1843, the tariff rate should go back to near the 1816 level. Okay. Well, President Jackson will declare victory on this. But at the same time, he theorizes that after this incident has been resolved, the next major situation that could bring disunion is the slave question. And obviously, this is happening in the 1830s, 25 plus years before the slave question does bring disunion in the form of the American Civil War. Finally, the last domestic policy of President Jackson will be the Indian removal. And this is the most controversial act of the Jackson administration, considered by most to be one of the most unhappy events in American history. This all comes about because of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This act of Congress will give the President of the United States the authority to negotiate treaties with native peoples and to purchase their tribal land. And the goal is to purchase the land and then resettle these tribes to the west outside the borders of the United States. This is essentially moving the Native Americans out of the East Coast. Well, this will lead to a court case in 1832 called Worcester v. Georgia. And this court case comes about because there's two missionaries, Samuel Worcester and Elijah Butler. And they will be arrested for opposition to Indian removal, and they will be sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Now, they will appeal, and their appeal says that the government had no jurisdiction because they lived on native tribal lands. And so the Supreme Court will take a look at this. And Chief Justice John Marshall will make the ruling that the state and federal government cannot impose laws on tribal land. And this is because they considered Native American tribes to be sovereign, independent states. And since Indian tribes are independent sovereign states or countries, they had to be treated as such. And it was a 5-4 decision. 5-3 decision, sorry. And there was one concurrence, by the way. Associate Justice McLean, who had been nominated by Jackson in 1829, actually concurs with the majority. So Marshall and then Associate Justices Johnson, Duval, Story, and Thompson, and then they're joined by McLean. Now, Henry Baldwin, who had been nominated by Andrew Jackson to fill a seat, does dissent, arguing the president does have the right to do this. Now, Jackson's response was essentially to ignore the United States Supreme Court ruling. And he will order the removal of Native Americans from the East. And beginning at this stage, 45,000 Indians will be removed. 100 million acres will be purchased from them for approximately $68 million. They will be given in exchange 32 acres in the West for resettlement. So they had 100 million acres, and they're going to be given 32 acres. Jackson, by the way, is heavily criticized for this policy, but actually most of it was carried out by his successor, President Martin Van Buren. So actually he didn't take a lot of the, he didn't get a lot of the blame for this, at least legally. But most people knew that this was his policy and that he was the one that pushed for it. So even though Van Buren does it, most people look back at Jackson for being the one who actually did this. Well, here in 1832, we have a presidential election, and President Andrew Jackson will be running for a second term. But due to the chaos of the election of 1824, the way that political parties will choose presidential nominees will change. Instead of congressional caucuses doing it, the parties would now hold nominating conventions. Obviously, being the incumbent president of the United States, it meant that Jackson, of course, obviously would be renominated for president. And this is, by the way, the first Democratic National Convention being held in Baltimore, Maryland here in 1832. Martin Van Buren will be nominated to replace John C. Calhoun as vice president. The anti-Masonic Party will actually run a candidate here. They will nominate William Wirt for president and Amos Ellmaker for vice president, but they really didn't have much of a chance. But the National Republican Party, the supporters of Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, will also have a nominating convention in Baltimore, Maryland, and they will nominate Henry Clay from Kentucky to be the president and John Sargent for vice president. So this will be Jackson's chance to win a second term. Now, the campaign will be based around mainly the Bank of the United States of America, which had seen its charter vetoed by Jackson in early 1832. Henry Clay had hoped to beat Jackson in the electoral vote-rich areas like Pennsylvania and New York. Mainly Pennsylvania, because at the time that was where the headquarters of the Bank of the United States was. So he is going to run on an anti-veto campaign. Clay and his supporters will also accuse Jackson of abusing veto power. They call him, quote, King Andrew. These attacks on Jackson fail mostly because he was able to convince the common man that, hey, look, I'm here for you. I am here to help you in this. So when you look at the campaign, though, the results of the campaign, Henry Clay will get 25% of the popular vote compared to 55% for Jackson and Van Buren. But when it came to the electoral vote, Jackson and Van Buren get 219, which is 77% of the outstanding electoral vote. Clay and Sargent will get 17% of the electoral vote. So Andrew Jackson is overwhelmingly reelected President of the United States. Now in 1836, President Jackson decides to retire, and the Democrats will choose Vice President Martin Van Buren to be their candidate for president at their Democratic National Convention in 1835. Van Buren will support his friend Richard Mentor Johnson to run to succeed him as vice president. Now, the Whig Party, which had just been founded after the 1832 election, devises a plan to steal the presidency from the Jackson-Van Buren faction. What they decide to do is run 4 regional campaigns. Their goal is to force the House of Representatives to decide the election. So they're going to run General and former Senator William Henry Harrison of Ohio, who at that time was living in Indiana. He will be the Western candidate. Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, he will run as the Northern candidate. Senator Hugh White of Tennessee and Senator Willie Pearson Magnum will run as the Southern candidates. This is the only time in American history that a political party will intentionally run multiple candidates to try to split the vote and prevent anyone from getting an electoral majority in the Electoral College. Now, during this campaign, the Whigs will attack Jackson and Van Buren, and they will attack them in a very nasty way. But remember that the Democratic Party was a superior party organization at this point, and they were just too much for the Whigs to overcome. And let's face it, Van Buren was a superior politician and candidate. So when the election came down, Van Buren gets 170 electoral votes, which is good for 50, I believe that was 58% of the electoral vote. That is more than what's required for president. But William Henry Harrison, if you look at the popular vote just for a minute. William Henry Harrison gets 36.5% of the popular vote. White gets about 9.7%. This chart says 10%. Split the difference. I think my numbers say 146, 107. This says 146. Obviously, these are raw totals are a little bit different in each one. And then Daniel Webster, he gets 41,201, which is good for about 2.5 to 2.7% of the popular vote. Now, you add that up, 46, 47, 48, you're looking at 48, 49% of the popular vote. So what this says is for Van Buren, he needs to be very careful. He needs to be very careful about how this is going to continue because the reality of it is there's no room for error. Yes, he won a big electoral college victory, but popular vote wise, it's very, very close. So he needs to keep an eye on this. Now, as far as this election, this is the last election to see a sitting vice president win the election as president of the United States directly after the president that he served under. It will be the last one until 1988, when George Herbert Walker Bush was elected president to succeed Ronald Reagan, who he had served as vice president for. This is also the first and last time that a vice presidential election will have to go to the Senate. It actually did work for the vice president. And so the Senate will have to choose the vice president, and they do. They choose Richard Mentor Johnson. By the way, on the last day of his presidency, Jackson supposedly said when he sat down for an interview, they asked, "What's your biggest regret?" And he said, "It's that I didn't shoot Henry Clay or hang John C. Calhoun." So for people who are so taken aback about the terrible language and behavior of President Donald Trump currently, just imagine Jackson was no picnic to deal with either. Jackson will retire to Nashville, Tennessee, where he continues to give Democratic candidates, politicians advice. He continues to advocate for the preservation of the Union. He denounces secession, even though, by the way, he is a slave owner. He'll live until June of 1845 when he dies at his home, the Hermitage in Tennessee. And most people chalk up his death to being due to heart failure. So President Andrew Jackson is dead, and we're now ushering in a new, supposedly, Democratic golden age. Now, the next president of the United States is Martin Van Buren, and Van Buren will be president from 1837 to 1841. Martin Van Buren was born in Kinderhook, New York in 1782. Kinderhook, New York, by the way, is about 25 miles south of Albany, New York. He was the son of Abraham Van Buren, who was a tavern keeper, and Maria Van Allen. His great-great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Mason Van Buren, came to America in 1631. So his family has been here since essentially the founding of New Netherlands. He apprenticed law at the age of 14 years old. He was admitted to the bar in 1803. In 1807, he married for the first time, married a woman by the name of Hannah Hoyce, and they will have 5 sons: Abraham, John, Martin, Winfield Scott, and Smith Thompson. They also have 1 stillborn daughter. Mrs. Van Buren will die after they were married for 12 years. She dies in February 1819. She's 35 years old, and Martin Van Buren will never remarry the rest of his life. Martin Van Buren, just a couple things about him personally. He was the first president from a non-British background. He was not English, Scottish, Irish, or Welsh. His family was from the Netherlands or Dutch. He was the first president to not experience the American Revolution. He was born before the Revolution was over, but he was not even 1 when the treaty was officially signed. He's the only president whose first language was not English. His first language was Dutch. He spoke Dutch at home. He was also the first president born a citizen of the United States, not the United Kingdom. And this is obviously because the American Revolution was winding down and we had already declared our independence. With his election to the presidency, Martin Van Buren became the only other man in American history to win what we call the political Triple Crown, other than Thomas Jefferson. And that political Triple Crown is Secretary of State, Vice President, and President. President Van Buren is the first of 8 U.S. presidents between Jackson and Abraham Lincoln to serve only 1 term. He will not win a second term in 1840, and no president between him and Abraham Lincoln will be able to win a second term. This is a weird thing in American history. Jackson's a two-term president, Lincoln's a two-term president, and then in the almost 20 years in between, nobody can win re-election. It's a very strange era in American history. By the way, if you look at President Van Buren, if you have ever seen the TV show The Munsters, now this was an old TV show from the 60s. I think it was the 60s. Don't quote me on that. It might be older, but I vaguely remember it being 60s. It was black and white. If you remember the TV show The Munsters, there's a character called Grandpa Munster. Grandpa Munster was actually modeled off the appearance of Martin Van Buren. So if you don't know who Grandpa Munster is, look him up. President Van Buren, when asked what kind of president he wanted to be, he said, quote, "I wish to follow in the footsteps of my illustrious predecessor," end quote. And so he kept most of Andrew Jackson's cabinet. He was also probably one of the most experienced, other than maybe John Quincy Adams, people to serve as president. He had served in local government as the surrogate of Columbia County. He also was a member of the New York Senate. He was also Attorney General of New York. He finally was elected a U.S. Senator from New York, where he served for one term. He was elected governor of New York. He served for a few months before President Jackson nominated him to be U.S. Secretary of State. He served as Secretary of State from 1829 to 1831. He then became the U.S. Ambassador to the United Kingdom from 1831 to 32. And finally, for the second term of President Jackson, he was Vice President of the United States from 1833 to 37. So Van Buren was highly qualified and had a highly distinguished political career before becoming president in 1837. Now let's look at the domestic affairs of President Van Buren. Well, first of all, he had to deal with the Panic of 1837. And this was mainly due to the Jackson administration's economic policies, including the closing of the Bank of the United States of America. Towards the end of the Jackson administration, inflation was running away, and it resulted in banks only accepting gold and silver coinage. They refused to accept government-issued paper money. And beginning in May of 1837, you see the beginning of an economic depression. This will be a 5-year depression that was one of the worst economic panics in American history up to the Great Depression. Many banks will fail. You have record high unemployment. And Van Buren's argument for solving the problem was advocating for lower tariffs, free trade, and using a system of government bonds to pay the national debt. And this will lead to his idea in 1840 of what he called the independent treasury. This would be when the Treasury Department was given control of all federal funds, and that by 1843, all debts must be paid by gold or silver coinage. So he is advocating for what now today we would refer to as the Federal Reserve. A recreation of a centralized American bank. Another issue that Van Buren's going to have to deal with is the Amistad situation. President Van Buren has a dangerous issue that he has to navigate in pre-Civil War America, and that is, of course, slavery. In July of 1839, a Spanish slave ship, La Amistad, which means friendship, saw a slave revolt where 57 Africans, led by Joseph Cinque, captured the crew and sailed into American waters. The ship was seized by the U.S. Navy. They were taken to Connecticut, where they were to be sold as slaves. And this will become a major symbol of the growing abolitionist movement. The abolitionists will sue in local court. They want the Africans freed and returned to their homeland. And their argument correctly stated that the British-Spanish Treaty of 1817 outlawed the African slave trade, and they said that this was an illegal act. These people should never have been taken from their home in Sierra Leone. Therefore, they're not slaves, but rather victims of illegal kidnapping. Now, Spain did not dispute this, but argued that since the incident had happened on a Spanish ship in Spanish territorial waters, that the U.S. court had no jurisdiction. Therefore, the ship and the cargo had to be returned to the Spanish. Well, the lower courts actually did rule for the Spanish. They said that the Spanish ship, the cargo, had to be returned. Now, President Van Buren, hoping to gain Southern support in the upcoming election, will side with the lower court and orders the African slaves and the ship to be turned over to Spanish authorities. Now, the abolitionists will actually appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and they overturn the lower court verdict, saying the ship should be returned to the Spanish, but the slaves, being illegally obtained, should be returned to Africa by the U.S. Navy. So President Van Buren, again hoping to add Southern support, disagrees, and he asks that the Supreme Court make a ruling. And this court case will be called U.S. v. Amistad, and it's ruled in 1841. And what the Supreme Court will do is they will hear from Attorney General Henry Gilpin, who declares that the slaves were criminal and that their enslavement was justified. Defending the African slaves is former President John Quincy Adams. He will essentially be on the council for the African slaves. He argues that international law was broken by obtaining these slaves, and therefore the current president, Martin Van Buren, could not legally release the slaves to the Spanish. Now, Chief Justice Roger Taney, along with a majority of the court, will rule that the African slaves had been taken illegally and therefore had to be returned to Africa, and that the President of the United States had no legal authority to return these men to slavery due to international law. But by the time this happened, by the time this ruling came down, Van Buren was in the process of leaving office. He had already lost the election of 1840. By the way, he ironically actually agreed with the decision. He was secretly an abolitionist, and later in the 1850s would support emancipation. But he was trying to essentially win re-election using this slavery issue. By the way, the survivors of the Amistad were returned to Sierra Leone by the U.S. Navy in 1842. Another issue that Van Buren has to deal with is the Mormon issue. In 1839, Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, will visit President Van Buren to discuss the federal government, helping his 20,000 followers that are living in Missouri. The state government was starting to come down on them for some of their religious belief, led by Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs. Lilburn Boggs actually argued that the Mormons should either be relocated or exterminated. Fun fact about freedom of religion, huh? Well, Smith will argue that the federal government should be involved as Missouri law violated the First Amendment. And Van Buren says to Joseph Smith, "Your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you. If I take up for you, I shall lose the vote in Missouri." Well, he loses the election anyway. As I said before, when it comes to Indian removal, President Van Buren will continue the policies of the previous administration by resettling Indians of the American Southeast, the Indians of what we call the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. They will be moved to the Oklahoma Territory. This forced march across the American Southeast, northwest to Oklahoma Territory will be called the Trail of Tears, and you'll see many natives die of exposure and or disease before they reach Indian Territory. And this is considered one of the saddest, most disgusting events in American history. Now let's look at the foreign affairs of the Van Buren administration. And I have to admit, two of these are two of my favorites. First is the Caroline Affair. The Caroline Affair has to do with Canadian rebels led by a guy by the name of William Lyon Mackenzie. And they were trying to gain independence from the British and create a Canadian republic. And after they led an unsuccessful uprising against the British authorities, they will flee to the United States and declared themselves the Republic of Canada. Now, obviously, Americans will sympathize with them, given that that is what we did in 1775, 1776. So sympathizers will give them money, provisions, and arms, along with a steamship, the SS Caroline. Now, the British, fearing more hostilities, will cross the international border and seize the empty SS Caroline. They tow it to the currents and set it on fire, and then set it adrift over Niagara Falls. Now, Martin Van Buren will protest to the British government because they crossed the international border, but he is ignored. The American people, many of them wanted revenge for this incursion. They demanded a harder stand by the U.S. government. And the president was only willing to send U.S. troops under the command of General Winfield Scott to the border. But they were to close the rebel bases and protect American sovereignty. They were not to engage the British or help the Canadians in any way. The second thing that happens during his administration, foreign affairs-wise, is called the Aroostook War. And this is my favorite one. After the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the American and British officials never actually clarified the border between British North America, Canada, and the United States. So this will lead to some border conflicts between lumberjacks on both sides, and this will become what we call the undeclared Aroostook War in May of 1838. There's no bloodshed. It's more of them just beating each other up, fist fights. But just imagine a bunch of lumberjacks out in the wilderness getting into fist fights over where the border is. As I said, no bloodshed. No one died from this. But it did further inflame public opinion on both sides of the border. And Van Buren has to be cautious because he does not want to lead to another war. But unfortunately, his cautious behavior led to people being further disappointed by his presidency. Another issue that he has to deal with is Texas annexation. Now, there is this myth about Texas, that Texas was founded as an independent sovereign country. That's technically not true. The Republic of Texas was founded with the sole argument that they wanted to become a state within the United States. They didn't even want to be an independent country. But when the Republic of Texas broke away from Mexico in 1836, 1837, they went to the Jackson administration immediately and asked for immediate annexation. And Jackson said no. Jackson said he did not want to risk war with Mexico by annexing Texas. So the Republic of Texas keeps asking. And during the Van Buren administration, they find no friend in him either. Van Buren believed that if Texas became part of the Union, it would not only lead to a possible war with Mexico, it could lead to more sectional crisis over the slave question. So Van Buren will also refuse their requests, and Texas will continue to have to wait for statehood under the Republic of Texas banner. Finally, when it came to Mexico, the fact that they turned down annexation of Texas does give us some goodwill with Mexico, and President Van Buren will be able to settle a financial dispute between Mexico and U.S. citizens with negotiation instead of a threat of war. So it's a mixed bag when it comes to his foreign policy. Caroline Affair and the Aroostook War made him look weak. Texas annexation and negotiations with Mexico made him look a little stronger. Now, here in 1840, we have another presidential election. And President Van Buren will be facing re-election, where he's going to be forced to answer for the economic disaster. And this time he will be running against a unified Whig party. The Democrats will renominate Van Buren and Richard Mentor Johnson for the vice presidency. The Whigs, who hold their national convention in Harrisburg, will choose General William Henry Harrison to be the presidential nominee. Harrison, a Northerner, will choose John Tyler from Virginia to balance out the ticket. The Anti-Masonic Party, nearing its death, will also choose Harrison for president, but they will support Daniel Webster for vice president. Now, during the campaign, Harrison will follow General Washington and General Jackson by hyping his wartime record and arguing that he is a man of the people. This is ironic considering he was a wealthy man, and he was also highly educated. He was not what we would consider to be a man of the people, so to speak. The Whigs will attack Van Buren. They call him a snob who's living in luxury at public expense. Although we now know that most of the luxury that Van Buren was living in was actually spent from his own money. They said he ate off gold plates and silverware. They called him, quote, called his speeches the, quote, gold orations. Harrison, by the way, will be attacked for drinking hard cider, which was seen as something that was a low-income thing. And instead of turning away from it, he gives out this drink at campaign stops. It would be the equivalent of me running for president, me handing out Lone Star in Texas when I'm running for president. He'll also use the first actual campaign slogan. He was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, and so the campaign slogan for this election will be Tippecanoe and Tyler too. You'll see also songs and poems written to help with his election bid. Now, here are the results. When it comes to the Democratic Party, when you look at this, Martin Van Buren, unfortunately, he will have to pay for his 4 years in office. And he'll only get 60 electoral votes, which is only 20% of the electoral votes. William Henry Harrison gets 234 electoral votes. This is the largest landslide in a two-person race in American history at this time. Popular vote-wise, it's closer. It's 52.9% to 46.8%. The chart says 53% to 46, I think 46.75, but you know, what's 52.9 to 53? Just go with whatever number you feel, you know, positive with. Harrison, by the way, wins both Western settlers and Eastern bankers. Harrison is able to win New York, which is the home state of President Van Buren. He also wins Tennessee, where Andrew Jackson had actually come out of retirement to campaign on behalf of his former vice president. Van Buren will lose re-election by a large majority in the Electoral College, but as I said before, a small amount of the popular vote. Now, after leaving office, Van Buren will retire to Kinderhook, where he continues to pursue the presidency. He will seek the nomination in 1844, but he was not chosen by the party due to their renewed interest in the annexation of Texas, which he still, by the way, opposed. James K. Polk will end up getting the nomination instead. In 1848, he is nominated by the Free Soil Party, where he ends up coming in third. By the way, he may have actually cost the Democrats enough votes in New York to lose the presidency to Zachary Taylor. He was initially opposed to the election of Abraham Lincoln, but after the incompetence of President Buchanan, he supported Abraham Lincoln and the war effort. He ends up dying in the early days of the American Civil War of bronchial asthma and heart failure. He dies in July of 1862. So now, instead of an era of democratic prosperity, we will now look at the Whig era.